1 second. Alrighty, well, welcome everyone. It looks like Naomi's going to keep adding folks. I recognize most people here, but I'm also fairly new. So if it's your first time joining Building Dialogue, welcome. And if you're returning, of course, welcome back to Building Dialogue, our book group here at Historic Seattle. My name is Taylor. I'm the Community Events Manager here. And I also want to introduce and shout out my colleagues. I don't know if everyone's here yet, but I'll just shout out the people who I see. Eugenia, Jeff, Naomi. Naomi is here as Historic Seattle today. And Bailey is here. Hi, Bailey. So if you all want to unmute and just say hello, now is the time to do that.
Hey, everyone.
Hello, hello.
And also, hi, Cindy. I see you. Cindy's also with Historic Seattle. Sorry, I'm spotlit, so now I don't see you all in grid view anymore. But if there's anyone I missed, just unmute yourself and say hi at any time. Okay, so our mission at Historic Seattle is saving meaningful places to foster lively communities. With that, we also know that our properties and our programs occupy unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. This acknowledgement is not a substitute for developing relationships with Indigenous communities or for honoring Indigenous stories as we share our collective history, but it's a first step in recognizing the people whose land we occupy. This land acknowledgement is borrowed from the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, while we, Historic Seattle, our staff and our board work to develop our organization's own land acknowledgement. So when we have that developed, you will hear that at the beginning of each of our programs. So today we are discussing part 3, Forces of Decline and Regeneration, which is chapters 13 through 16 of Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities. I'm going to share our discussion guidelines with all of you in the chat and then just quickly review those with everyone. Oh, and of course, Naomi, can you actually share them? I'm sorry. Zoom isn't letting me share from my desktop. It's asking me to share from Google Drive and literally everything else, but unfortunately. And I know that we emailed them to you as well. Oh, technology, we'll get there. Okay, well, in the meantime, I'm gonna just jump over and start reading those. So we ask today that you self-regulate the same way that you would at an in-person discussion. We want you to be courteous and avoid interrupting when other people are speaking. If multiple folks want to contribute to the conversation, we love it. Please do, but we also ask that you either raise your hand or use the Zoom feature to raise your hand. And then we will get to you all in the order that we see you. And depending on our timing and the size of our group today, we may not get to everyone for every single question, but we will certainly do our best. Related to that, we want you to share the floor. So if you've already had a chance to speak and share, we definitely want to hear from everyone today, and we ask that you would allow others to do the same thing. We also want to avoid side conversations and tangents. Since we only have an hour together, the chat feature will be a great way to communicate to either a specific person or just ideas that we didn't get to in the time that we had allotted for that particular question. And then finally, just want to remind you all that points of view and opinions will differ because we are all different people and we all have different opinions about stuff, which is why book clubs are so awesome. We get to hear from everyone. But we do want to remind you to be respectful and keep our discussion today civil so that we can be a place where we politely listen and we learn and we explore. We want this to remain a safe space for everyone, for a safe space for all participants, and just really want to drill down that racism, sexism, homophobic comments, discrimination, insults, and anything of the sort will not be tolerated. Naomi, who is here as Historic Seattle, will boot you out. I don't think we're gonna need to do that, but she's ready if we have to get there and do that. So once our discussion begins, you all have the ability to mute and unmute yourself. And if anyone is not familiar with Zoom, the mute unmute button is actually on the bottom menu. It's all the way to the left. And if we get really excited and we can't hear because we're talking over each other, Naomi also has the power to mute you. So if suddenly you get muted, it's likely because we were wanting to hear from one person at a time, not that we don't want you to share. If you're familiar with the chat feature, again, make sure that you use that. The chat bar is also going to be on that bottom menu. For me, it's showing up in the middle, and if you click it, a box will just pop open to your right. Okay, and then I think that is everything. We can just dive right into our questions. So we decided this time last time we went by theme, this time we've organized the questions by chapter. We'll see if this works, and if we want to pivot and do theme again for our last discussion, then we can ask for your feedback at the end. But today we're going to get started with chapter 13, the self-destruction of diversity. And the first question that we're going to pose out to the group, Jane Jacobs could not have foreseen the pandemic, right? Who could have? But in what ways do you see this as a destruction of diversity? And go for it. And again, raise your hand or raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I almost feel like I'm at a staff meeting with so many all-stars from historic Seattle amongst the staff. So I guess just to kind of kick things off, I really see these chapters fitting in the context of the question to a warning and a challenge simultaneously. Truly, when you look at the requirements that that Jane talks about in terms of the mixture of ages of buildings, the idea that there needs to be a mixture of uses, certainly the pandemic has challenged that in fundamental ways. And, one thing that I just kind of think through is where are some of those opportunities, but also just the sense of how the space is defined. So there may be more for some, a geographic diversity that they can maintain, here in the area, and that whole idea of leaving, kind of downtown. But I think ultimately, when you look at the requirements and criteria, that Jane lays out, the pandemic has really compounded, the majority of that criteria.
Thank you, Ryan. Anyone else have a thought or a comment about this particular question? And if you just joined us, we are in chapter 13, the first question in our discussion guideline. Jane Jacobs could not have foreseen the pandemic. In what ways do you see this as a destruction of diversity?
When we were, when we were talking about this question before, it sort of dawned on me that some elements of the way our city is reacting to the pandemic actually have some positive impacts. We're seeing a lot more sort of parklets, a lot more pedestrian kind of people being outside on the street, which is something Jane certainly, advocates for. Closing down of streets and making them just sort of pedestrian areas. There are a few things I think that, maybe will have a long-term better impact than all negative from what we're going through right now.
Thank you, Jeff. Eugenia?
Yeah, you think about, I know retail has been having a harder time the last several years just because of a lot of online activity. But I think with the pandemic, a lot of the small businesses, whether you're talking about legacy businesses, older ones, or ones that have been around just only a few years, I think oftentimes they're struggling more. And you read about in any given neighborhood businesses that have closed this year and why, and that's a really big impact. It's these sort of small businesses that really help give a neighborhood its sort of identity and character. And when everything's shut down or people are staying at home, not every business can do was able to stay open, or if they're food related, they're not all able to do takeout. It's just sort of we saw some immediate impacts, but now we're sort of seeing more and more. And as the longer this goes on, it's just going to keep growing.
Me? I was thinking that it actually is exposing areas where there isn't diversity, where, I mean, like, and I'm thinking downtown, I'm thinking like certain parts of downtown where, you know, that resemble the parts that Jane was talking about in Philadelphia, where it was just used from 9 to 5 and people went home and then didn't have necessarily life in the evenings, and how that situation lacked diversity. So, and not, you know, was not sustainable for restaurants and shops and a variety of restaurants and shops and all the things that we want to have so that you have a 24-hour community sort of. I think that's been what the pandemic has shown me, and that areas that I wouldn't have necessarily thought about, like I live in Magnolia, and it's like, we have a little more diversity in terms of, in the way that she's speaking about it, where we have people living close to stores, businesses intermingle. Like it's not just 9 to 5, it's people there all the time. I think that's what it's exposed.
I think that coming together and the big city exploration is gone, and that attracting different people from different walks of life into the same concert of urban living and urban interaction is missing for the time being, or at least paused. And that challenges a lot of the principles that Death and Life of Great American Cities brought forward.
Thank you. So interestingly enough, both of your comments, Kristine and Rikki, we turn them on their head a little bit, bring us into our second question. And I'll read that. Jacobs asserts that there is, quote, the tendency for outstanding success in cities to destroy itself purely as a result of being successful. She says this can happen in streets, at small nodes of vitality, in groupings of streets, or in whole districts. In other words, successful places may become victim of their own success. Would love to ask you all, do you agree with her assessment? What is it that destroys the balance of success? And can you think of any Seattle neighborhoods that have been or are successful that have experienced this concept of self-destruction? And again, I put the link to the questions in the chat because some of our questions are pretty hardy, so you can read them too. Ryan?
I'm sorry, Naomi, were you going to speak?
No, I was telling you to go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Well, I think Rikki raises an excellent point in that last question in terms of that sense of the loss of having a lot of those social interactions, you know, that really underpins a lot of what Jane's saying. So, you know, thinking about, for instance, you know, living on Capitol Hill and walking to South Lake Union, where, you know, it's interesting to me that a lot of the major companies that are there support and really have been able to pivot as businesses and grow, creating products that are virtual interactions, yet being in that area, especially with the pandemic being the frame, the interactions, there's not really that chance for dynamic social interactions. It's more trying to just have your mask and walk, keep your 6 feet. And so, you know, there you have an entire neighborhood that's completely changed in use and in so many ways with the development. And I think about that, maybe that is a bit of a victim of its own success, where, you know, the money that came in, you know, not having the ability to have graduated, you know, rents to be able to afford a diversity of businesses and uses has kind of led to the conditions now of these buildings being there without many employees in them, and being devoid of having that interaction, you know, on the street level, and that idea of having vibrant storefronts to encourage community building.
I think that that's an interesting point of that, because it's actually really hard to think about this question during the pandemic, like, because it's just been so many months of you can't do the community building part, and thinking of what areas are successful right now versus 6 months ago is just really difficult. It just in terms of both the grief of the pandemic and also just it's been 6 months of it.
Hi, this is Harriet. I don't have a Seattle example of the success of destroying itself, but lots of you probably go up to Vancouver, and my son lives up there lived in the Kitsilano area on Broadway, where I just loved it. There were little shops of all kinds. You'd find the neatest little restaurant next to a kid's bookstore, next to a dollar shop. You could walk out there and just spend all day just enjoying the people and the community, and it was just delightful. And it was very successful, obviously. People loved it. The Vancouver house prices are crazy. And the next time I went up, some of them were gone and they were just boring apartment buildings. And Wyeth gave up, finally decided he had to buy a house, moved way away from there. And I said, oh, I'm so sad you're not there. And he says, Mom, there's nothing left there. All the little shops are gone. They're all boring apartment buildings. And another area, same thing up there out on 10th Avenue toward Point Grey. There was a George Jensen, lovely imported things shop next to a pasta shop next to the best quilt shop in the world. And those are all gone and become boring as they build higher cost, what do I want to say, consistent, exactly the same apartments. It's very sad. I don't have examples here so much like that, but I sure see it there, and it's very sad.
Thank you, Harriet.
Eugenia?
I think one of the examples locally is actually the Pike Pine area. I think those of you who have been here long enough have sort of seen the cycles. Seattle is very much a cycle, the city of cycles, of boom and bust. And, the adaptability and the charm of all the old auto row buildings, many of them have given way to either to full-on demolition or to facadism. And, because it's so close to transit and downtown, and it has all the walkability, pedestrian friendly and all that, I think it's become a victim of its own success in a way, because it's more developers want to go in there and build housing, of course. You want, increased density and that whole thing. But in doing so, they're tearing down the very places that give the neighborhood its character. I think the block that demonstrates this the most is where Bauhaus used to be, Bauhaus Coffee. And many of you are nodding heads, which block I'm talking about. I remember when what's called the Excelsior now, it was called a different building, Jeff might remember, but when it was redeveloped, I think the rents were like, some of them were as high as $4,000 a month, which is crazy. And of course, Bauhaus was gone. All the small businesses that were along that block were gone. And so it was interesting to sort of see what would go in there, what types of businesses would go in there, and what's surviving there. And it's just not quite the same. And so developers want to come in because it's a quote unquote hot neighborhood. It's this, that's that, but then it's destroying the very thing that's bringing that appeal to people to begin with.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So speaking of kind of how things can get destroyed, so chapter 14 is on the curse of border vacuums. So the first question that we have here circles back to like COVID specifically, and then we get into kind of some larger themes and examples of this outside of our current times and like how the pandemic has impacted us. But our first question is, Jacobs argues that, quote, the literal and continuous mingling of people present because of different purposes is the only device that keeps people safe. How have you seen this idea around safety manifest in post-COVID-19 Seattle?
MaryKate?
Yeah, it's not a positive example, but I live over on Weller near the JCCCW. So there's a lot of construction sites here, and this summer we were part of the area where there were just many fires set. There aren't people out, people are staying home. And so these construction sites that were not currently active, there were a lot of small fires, and those spilled over into, you know, people's trash cans getting set on fire. And that happened from Beacon Hill, I think, all the way up to Capitol Hill.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Alrighty. So our second question from this chapter is, Jacobs uses Central Park in New York City to illustrate the differences between seams and borders based on their public use and their accessibility. What examples of seams versus borders can you cite in Seattle, past and present?
Ryan?
Thank you. One interesting example that comes to mind is the Olympic Sculpture Park on the waterfront. You know, thinking about having the pedestrian bridge over the street, you know, being able to give you, you know, some of those unique views, and the idea of not having the preferencing of the car, which is very anti-Jane. Also the idea of having the sculptures to be a place to, you know, gather, and just thinking about, you know, from the perspective of the fact that you have kind of this, the street being its own border, and having that pedestrian bridge kind of, you know, create that in between space for observation and interaction. It's also one where I think, since it came into place, you know, I know it's part of a larger waterfront plan. I know that there's some challenges to that. I believe that came up last time in our discussion as well. But also, I think being able to embrace or re-embrace the waterfront, and it does cause a re-examination of what some of those borders are, thinking of the viaduct as well. So that's one space that kind of springs to mind, you know, when I think of this question.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, and Ryan, that actually is related to our next question. So I feel like we can just talk about either or both. We acknowledge that Seattle obviously is surrounded by various bodies of water, and we also wanted to discuss how our various waterfronts function as seams or borders. So thank you for kicking us off into that next question. And then kind of the subtext of that question is related to another comment that you just said. So with the removal of the Alaskan White Viaduct, which was a big border vacuum for us, there is great opportunity to create a connection between the waterfront and downtown and Pioneer Square. And I guess, you know, given what is currently planned, what we all know of with the waterfront and just recent waterfront happenings, you know, are we designing and building new border vacuums, or do you all feel like we're designing and building seams with our waterfront plans and our developments there?
So I haven't really seen much movement in terms of it turning into a seam. Like, is there more than just the beautifying process that they had in mind? Because really the main problems is that you basically stop at like First Avenue and Pike Place Market, and then getting down to the water is a task. Like, I used to do it as a workout. Like, basically it's either tourists down there or people using that walking path as like for biking or running. Anyone?
Eugenia?
I think it's a really good point. I think it depends on, so with the viaduct gone, obviously there, I mean, you could be in Pioneer Square or the market, or, I mean, like from Pioneer Square, what amazed me is, you know, you go down there, whether you're on First or Second, and you look to the west, is all of a sudden it's so much brighter now because the viaduct's gone. But what happened was, because the viaduct's, Alaskan Way itself is still there, right? So the street itself doesn't go away. And that's, I think, going to be, is it 6 lanes? I don't remember. Someone else on this call will probably remember, but it's going to be quite a barrier to get across a 6-lane street to the waterfront. And so it's it's interesting that in removing a border vacuum, we're still creating another one. And it's always that sort of that fight between, well, you need to keep traffic moving or industry moving, because there's a lot of because you divide the tunnel, you can only go through the city. You can't get off anywhere in between anymore. So you have to use some sort of road to get to these other places in between the tunnel exits and entrances. And so it's I think it's a conundrum, and it's definitely not going to be solved by a 6-lane street.
Thanks, Eugenia. Jeff?
I was just going to say, I think that the ferry terminal is an opportunity, or was an opportunity, to really kind of engage two sides of our region. It's sort of it's a point of expansion where people are coming and going from different parts of the sound. But sort of the idea of these sort of elevated walkways and, high density traffic. And I mean, I think it's more of it creates more of a border than what could be kind of a seam, I think. Of course, it's been under construction for so long, and it's hard to really know how it's going to impact the quality of life on the waterfront. But it does feel like it's a situation where different agencies are doing different things and probably aren't talking together very closely. So I expect that the improvements to the ferry terminal are not going to be, positive to the urban experience on the waterfront. I think it's much more about moving vehicles, which doesn't usually turn into a high quality space. So.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, when we talked about this question in our kind of planning, I thought about how long that the waterfront is, and that I think in different places of it, perhaps it could function as a seam. But I guess I don't feel super confident that we're going to get a fully functioning full waterfront. I think some of it will remain as a border. And I think, Jeff, that your point about different agencies kind of not working together, I think in the past has contributed to the waterfront as it exists today. And I don't know these things, but I from the little bit that I have kind of heard, I don't know that we're going to see it all as a seam in the way that it could be, but who knows? Life is changing all the time. Were there any other thoughts or contributions for this section from anyone? MaryKate?
It's not specific to the waterfront, but when I was reading this chapter, I kept thinking about the smaller parks in the city, like Occidental Square and Hinghey Park, and how they're not just seams, but they definitely don't create borders. They're mingling places. And I think I'm seeing that even during the pandemic, people have relaxed a little bit. They're going out. There is some socializing happening in those parks that are keeping those neighborhoods a little more vibrant than what I've seen, say, like in Queen Anne.
So with Occidental, I know that they do a lot of work with the Parks Department to make sure that that stays that way. And of the Seattle parks, that one seems to be the most successful with those programs. I know that they've done a lot of different ones around town with just even putting chairs in sometimes that are removable or just to test things. But that one, they do like what are they doing right now? They're installing something with Olson Kundig that's like a pavilion right now that I haven't seen in person, but I've seen online. But that one seems to be the best programmed park while still maintaining a sense of just come and hang out.
Totally agree. Brian?
Thanks for bringing that example up, Molly, and discussing it. I think one of, as we talk about kind of agency coordination and this idea of who's kind of negotiating or managing the space, I think part of the success is twofold. One being very early on at Occidental, they had started the art walks, and so I think that kind of contributed, like a legacy and a buildup of programming and having the outdoor space, be accessible for this mingling and interaction. And also in 2015 is when Downtown Seattle Association started to, work within the community for activating the space. And that's where you saw, more of the pop-ups and as well as the cleaning and maintenance as well of the space.
Eugenia?
Yeah, and also that half block where the new warehouse or headquarters is, that was a parking lot. so that clearly didn't really add anything to the neighborhood other than more parking. But so to have new construction in a historic district, that's always a big deal. And one of that scale, it did get approved by the Pioneer Square Board. But you know, they have retail facing the park, and so having that activity there and office workers and things like that, I think that really contributed to improving that part of the neighborhood. And one, switching gears, talking about seams and borders, obviously I-5 is but I think the I-5, the lit I-5 movement is really a huge effort to try to build seams and connections between downtown and the communities on the east side of I-5. And so I think that movement has been gaining a lot of traction. And obviously the Freeway Park is the original litting of I-5 project. As a modernist fan, I love Freeway Park, whether it's successful in being a seam or a border itself is sort of a whole other question. But yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to move us along to chapter 15, the chapter on unslumming and slumming. We have just a few questions, and I think the way that we did the last one was great, so we can jump around, but I'll read the first one. How can we drive investments in neighborhoods that may not have immediate returns on the investments? Yes, MaryKate. Fair response. Anyone have thoughts? All ideas are just a safe space, you know? Okay, I'll read our second one, and then maybe we can like come back to that one. Does slum mean the same thing now as it did then? And recognizing that we don't generally use the word slum today. And what, if any, examples of slums do we have in Seattle and its surrounding areas? MaryKate?
I mean, I think you can start with Yesler Terrace, which was, an original slum clearance project that turned into Yesler Terrace that is now being redeveloped. So it's multiple layers of, it just seemed to illustrate that point of, these are different theories of how to fix this, but it doesn't seem to necessarily involve the people that live there in the way that it should, even with the long redevelopment plan. Although I do think mixed income up there is a good thing overall. And that's a good example of a place where we've tried to create a seam with the Yesler Hill climb.
Thank you. And thanks for connecting that to our seams and borders conversation. Another thing that kind of related to this that came up in our kind of planning conversation was, does Jane Jacobs even define slum in the chapter? And I think that question is relevant to the part 2 of this, like what, if any, examples of slums do we have in Seattle and our surrounding areas? So I guess I'm throwing in a third part of the question. Does anyone feel like she actually defined what slum means? And then I guess you don't have to answer that, but then the other example of places in our area that could fit that definition that you either definitely saw or you inferred based on what she put in the chapter.
My sense of it was that overcrowding was a big part of the definition. And I actually had a hard time imagining like the slum in Seattle that would be like a parallel to what she was referring to in New York or Boston or one of these, like, and because of that, because I don't think we've ever had, or at least not in my lifetime, which isn't that long, but like the sort of the serious overcrowding that she was talking about. And also, I think part of it was aesthetic, like the sense of this just doesn't look nice. It's messy, and we want to clean it up, and we want to make it look better. And from that standpoint, I think we probably do have some neighborhoods where people feel that way, where folks are not as, are less well off, and maybe it doesn't look as nice. But I just couldn't imagine the slum in Seattle as a parallel to what she was referring to. And so that was harder, like some of these questions, like harder to look at that in a local way. So.
Totally. I remember my aunt married someone who grew up in Detroit, and the first time he came to Seattle, we were driving him around, and he's like, so does Seattle have any projects at all? And we were driving ironically by Yesler Terrace when he asked the question. And my aunt was like, well, growing up, that was one. And he was like, those apartments that overlook downtown and the waterfront. And he just like couldn't wrap his mind around that here, having grown up in Detroit and then moving to, I can't remember where in New York he moved to as a teenager. But similarly, Kristine, when we got to this question, it made me think about that moment and that story, just based on what slum and like projects had looked like for him. Ryan?
Thank you. So I think also, like Kristine, I had trouble imagining being able to make that connection to Seattle and this idea of slum. I also kind of struggled to find where there was a definition. Like I found reference, like when she got into unslumming, it started to kind of take shape, but I do think that there were some tacit assumptions, that were going on, and also to consider that she also very much was reacting to the Robert Moses era. Robert Moses had a pretty clear definition of slum, and using that as a cudgel for, being able to push the freeways through and the expressways, as well as his own vision of where he wanted to go. So I think that's part of it. But it was interesting because I wrote down just a few things in terms of unslumming. I guess I'm jumping into the next question, Taylor. It seemed to be galloping away. So the idea, she talked about neighborhoods that are organic, quote unquote, that have, quote, eyes on the street, can unslum themselves through essentially neighborhood actions, and that idea of kind of political action I was picking up on too. So it is interesting that was brought up as one of the questions, because I wasn't finding that definition, but I do think that definitely through a Moses lens underpins part of what she's talking about. And also, this came up last time, to the degree that we can make the direct connection to Seattle for so much of what she's talking about being based in a New York City experience.
Thank you, Ryan. And yes, let's totally move into how does unslumming take place. I think I saw Eugenia and then Bailey.
Yeah, I want to be not about unslumming, but slums. I think it's maybe some of the closest I've seen here in Seattle. So I used to work at the city, and I staff the International Special Review District. So it's a neighborhood that I know really well. And the ID has, in addition to probably Pioneer Square, probably that's where the single room occupancy hotels have been historically here in Seattle. And so I probably went into almost all of them. And a lot of the conditions in some of these buildings were not good. I mean, they were substandard. I mean, there were, and it had nothing to do with the size of the units, because, if they're small, they have shared bathrooms. If it's kept up well, everything's fine. But but a lot of them were not. And I think that's probably the closest that I've seen here to conditions that, that aren't really good living conditions. And it takes advantage of mostly elderly Chinese people, and who didn't have a whole lot of resources. And if you think about how it's paid, it's not like it's an apartment, it's daily rates. I mean, it's just sort of, they end up paying quite a bit for like not good housing at all. So some of these buildings have been rehab, and nice affordable housing has been put in, which is good. But that was just sort of the kind of closest example I could think of.
Thank you, Eugenia. Bailey?
Yeah, I was going to use an example in the idea as well to the question about how to incentivize investment in areas that aren't immediately profitable. And I think a huge part of the solution lies in like the small advocacy groups that are kind of specialized to specific neighborhoods, because I think the solutions are really unique to different areas, even though the problem may manifest and look the outcome of the problem may look the same in multiple places. The solution is oftentimes different, and Friends of Little Saigon has just done incredible work to bring investment into the neighborhood. And I think a lot of that is, building community pride. And this also, relates to what Jane Jacobs says about unslumming and the need for people that are in that community to stay and not want to escape, but to and be replaced by somebody else who doesn't have choice otherwise, but instead to build the community up and improve it and recommit to it. What the International District may need is different than what Georgetown may need. They need a school, and so I think that these small advocacy groups can go a long way in, and also advocating for funding from different entities, and really, having a specialized plan to drive investment to specific neighborhoods that need it.
Thanks, everyone. And then just want to shout out everyone in the chat. These are really great comments. Thank you, Marlene. The comment reads, Seattle has building less slums. So city parks, streets, and highway frontages signed highways with tents on them. And then Rikki, I saw your response. Thank you for pointing that out, that may look different here, and that slums don't necessarily have to be tied to physical buildings, because that is absolutely relevant for our times and our city here. I think that before we move over to chapter 16, does anyone have a specific thought or comment about how unslumming takes place? Any feels around that?
Well, I just wanted to make sure we highlighted what Bailey just mentioned with the escape versus staying and building. That's one of the big things that's happening in the CD, especially, is that there have been people that have been building it up for ages, and now people are buying it up and developing it, and it's not really helping anyone that actually was there before, which is a major issue. Like, if we're going to be looking at like those various documentaries too, like the one that was in the comments from Vanishing Seattle, I know there's one from, I think it's, I'm forgetting the name of them, but there's also one for the CD too.
Thanks, Molly. And that's actually a great segue into the next chapter, gradual money and cataclysmic money. So this first question is pretty lengthy, so bear with me, and then we can really take it apart and chew on it. So a major theme in the book is how gradual and more organic processes for change benefit neighborhoods and communities, as opposed to abrupt or large scale or interruptions that destroy a place. So in chapter 16, Jane Jacobs focuses on money and how the lack of access to it, or access to it at a reasonable rate, adversely impacts investment, both great or small, in residential and in business properties. So here's the question. What are the three principal kinds of money that finance and shape most of the changes that occur in residential and business properties? And do these same three exist today in the same context? And I'll just go ahead and read the second question, because I think they're related. The word redlining is not used by Jacobs in this book. And then what is the difference between blacklisting and redlining? So we can talk about them in either order, but I will give you all the floor. And I may have missed a hand, so if you waved at me, can you please wave again? Harriet?
One of the things that I don't know quite how it fits into the types of money and so on, but of course, one of the huge things we see here is all the private development money. Developers come in and build and wipe out things or improve things depending on what's going on. And so that's really a big type of money that comes in. It's not so much where they borrow the money or what the rates are, it's that these are the big developer things and needs to get mentioned, I think.
Thanks, Harriet. MaryKate, and then Kristine.
I think if you look at, say, the difference between what happened in the ID from the 70s through the 2000s with gradual redevelopment and you know, reinvestment in the properties there versus what's happening in the CD right now, where there's big money coming in. It's mostly private money. It's not the same type of packages, but it's bigger change versus a more gradual change that is a little bit more community based. And I think that was what came to mind to illustrate the differences between the two types. But it's hard to sustain that small gradual money. There's not, I mean, it's not a sexy grant proposition, so it doesn't get funded.
Thank you. Kristine?
I just happened to turn to the page that had the 3 types of money, so I thought I would share. So it was non-governmental lending, which I assume is like banks. And then the second kind was government. And then the third kind was sort of the shadow investment, shadow world of investment, which I think could also encompass community, like interpersonal community lending or like bartering or that kind of thing. So it was not necessarily sort of institutional lending in the traditional sense, which would probably be covered by the first type of money. So I'm not sure how, I'm actually not that, I don't know that much about what's going on in Seattle as far as the different type of investment, but I guess my guess would be that it's a lot of the first type. It's a lot of just, you know, either company, like private investment through traditional banking. And then that's how, you know, projects are being done, unless it's the government, unless it's the city or something. But I don't know, maybe other people know more about that.
Anyone have a thought or a response to Kristine's comment? Kai?
Yeah, I think what we are experiencing more and more in Seattle is the influence of real estate investment trusts, REITs, that are really sort of big money because land's so expensive here and the development costs are so expensive here that your usual mom and pop type of developer who's more acutely aware of the needs of community are being priced out. And you see REITs coming in as purely an investment play. You know, there's a lot of money and they need to park money somewhere. And it really is, that's why I think a lot of times you see 5/1 type of construction with very bland, very, you know, the subway and the bank and the nail salon on the first floor as the profile of first floor, because you have a model that's a sort of a plug and play type of model that comes from these real estate investment trusts that don't respond to local needs and desires and cares. I think just that the influence of outside big investment type of trusts really influence what we're seeing today in Seattle.
Thank you. Jeff?
I just was going to follow on with what Kai said. I know that I had a hard time sort of understanding or envisioning what the shadow money was or what it could be. But I think I know that it's sort of related to what Kai was saying. There are these developer-owned banks that are really not public banks at all. They're really facilitating kind of small developers getting together and financing their own projects and creating a certain kind of building type. Mostly, I know of townhouse developers who use these, and they're all kind of owners in the banks as well. And I feel like there's something about that that just perpetuates sort of taking over neighborhoods with a certain type of building, like these multiple townhouses on a single family lot, for example, that really changes the quality of our cities, and it creates a lack of diversity and sameness. And it's sort of this undercurrent of financing that I think most people aren't really aware of. But because so many of these developers use these kinds of financing tools, it really does have a great impact.
Thank you for that information and context. Does anyone else have anything to add to this section? Or really, I'm just checking our time, any of the chapters or topics in this part 3 of the book? Now would be, I think, the time to share your finals. I know that we breezed through all of the questions. Molly?
I just wanted to say, even though no one's really engaging that much on the redlining versus blacklisting, I really appreciate you including that question, because that's one of the things that I was thinking about the entire time I was reading this part, is that, you know, when she's talking about slums or blacklisting and all of that, there's a lot of, let's be real, racial things that she's not touching on. The redlining would cover, you know, neighborhoods that were blacklisted because of race more than anything else. And it's just really interesting to read that, and not, especially during this time when we're being encouraged to do so much reading about different racial issues, that it's just not there. And it's kind of glaring at me that it's not being said.
Thank you for that. I mean, and kind of related to that, and then just like types of money that can finance businesses, a handful of people in my life who I think all are from Seattle are in the process of building their businesses up and looking for brick and mortar spaces, and crowdfunding has become a very interesting component of how at least friends in my life are able to finance physical spaces for themselves. And where they're going, either in the city or out of the city, has also been very interesting to just watch from the sidelines based on the type of money that they're able to gather for their businesses. Oh, and Harriet.
Well, a couple things. Subjects have changed a little since I said that. One of the big money things we didn't do was when Paul Allen wanted to provide so much of the land to build the commons, so the city voters didn't go along with doing it. Your whole South Lake Union thing would have a totally different look. It wouldn't be there the way it is now. So that commons was an example of big one-time money that didn't happen. And then back to the redlining or blacklisting, not quite those terms, but this was about 1960, and we were wanting to buy, well, we really couldn't afford it in the end, but the house that Mary McCarthy had lived in on 35th near Cherry, and loved the house. But the real estate lady said, you don't even want to look there. Colored people are about to move into that area. I should warn you. And right up front, big major downtown, real estate firm telling you that. It was, if I could have swung it, we would have bought it just to show her. But place was falling down or needed work, and we didn't do it. But that was my first real encounter with how blatant that was.
Thank you, Harriet. Bailey?
Yeah, I was also going to comment on, at one point in this chapter, Jacob says that like the blacklisting isn't personal, or like the lack of investing in certain places isn't personal, and that some of the examples she gave were like people from, or that were looking for lending in certain areas were able to acquire lending for projects or investments in other areas without a problem. And there's a huge like missing piece to that perhaps people that didn't have alternative places to ask for lending for were, being discriminated against because of the areas that they were seeking funding and lending for. So it's, and somebody who, I don't know, knows people that the personal discrimination wouldn't apply to would be oblivious to it happening to people that were being actively discriminated against.
Thanks, Bailey. All right, can MaryKate?
didn't seem, one of the things I didn't see in this that I thought would be interesting is this book was written far enough away that some of the policies, the World War II funding policies for homes with the VA loans and the FHA standards that created redlining, there isn't much analysis of that. And maybe that's just lack of distance from that and lack of seeing how that would play out and how these policies that were implicitly rather than explicitly racist became explicitly racist as time went on. She seems like she should be tuned in enough to have written about that. And I guess I wonder about that omission too.
Harriet?
No, sorry, I wasn't trying to raise my hand. I was just probably looking at something in the room.
No problem. Does anyone have a response to what MaryKate just said before we close out? Okay, well, I appreciate you bringing that up. And that is a very interesting question to pose, especially since we are further removed from the time that the book was written. And we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll incorporate that into our questions for the
Can I
final
say
chapter.
something? Doug?
Of course.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I haven't been able to listen very well. I actually sold a bike during the process, during this session this day. But I have moved back here from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I taught at the University of Michigan. And I'm giving a pro bono course at UW this term, and I just gave a lecture this morning on Jane Jacobs. And I'll finish it on Friday. So I first read her book 40 years ago, probably about the time it came out. And I just wanted to put it in a little perspective as I tried to this morning. She was fighting, the decentrists promoted by her intellectual peer, the great writer, his name escapes me right now, her real intellectual rival. I'll think of it in a minute. She was also fighting monarchists. She was fighting the City Beautiful movement out of England. She was fighting Garden City movement. She was fighting neoclassicism. She was fighting so many different things simultaneously. She was a real hero, and she should be put in the same category as another woman of her generation, Rachel Carson. These two women just had an immense impact on the world. I think The Life and Death of Great American Cities is the single most influential book written about urban planning of the 20th century, the entire century. Huge impact. And as you know, she went on to write some other wonderful books, but I just wanted to add a little sort of historical perspective to her extraordinary importance and ongoing impact. She's still read in all, she's required reading in my course. So let us not forget what a hero she is. Saint Jane, I call her. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. That's a great note to end on, unless anyone else has a comment for us. Okay, well, we are at our time. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for a great discussion. And then our next and final book club meeting will be next month, Wednesday, November 18th. We'll meet at noon again on Zoom, same Zoom link, and we'll be covering part 4, Different Tactics, which will be chapters 17 through 22 of the book. Again, thanks for coming. See you all
Thank
in
you.
a month.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.